The message arrived close to midnight, just a single line from my son, Liam. "Mom, please don't come to the ceremony. Respect my decision." No greeting, no explanation, not a single familiar word a mother would expect to see. I read it over and over, hoping I had misunderstood. But no, those cold words felt completely foreign, nothing like the child I had raised for decades. My heart sank, not because I was being rejected, but because I felt, very clearly, that something was being hidden. This wasn't just a family disagreement. There was the scent of manipulation, the shadow of money, and something profoundly wrong, far beyond what I could see at that moment. I sat in silence for a long time and realized I was standing before a choice, and if I choose wrong, I might lose my son forever. My name is Eleanor. I am 63 years old. I live alone in a small house in the suburbs, years after my husband passed away. I'm not flashy or wealthy, and I'm not loud or confrontational. I believe in doing what's right. I believe that if you live honestly, the answers will come sooner or later. I'm no longer young, but I am not someone to be ignored. Before I continue, I would like to make a point. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to many families who are quietly trying to hold on to what's right. If you believe in family values, kindness, and listening, stay with me. Subscribe to the channel so we can share this journey together. I became a single mother when Liam was only 11 years old. His father passed away after a sudden illness, so fast that I didn't even have time to prepare myself to tell my son that from that day on, everything would be different. At the funeral, Liam held my hand tightly. He didn't cry much. He was just silent. I understood then that from that moment on, I was not only his mother, but his only anchor. The years that followed were not easy. I worked 2 jobs simultaneously. During the day, I worked at a small office. In the evenings, I took on bookkeeping work for neighborhood shops. There were nights when I fell asleep at the kitchen table, the clock already past midnight, while my son's lunch for the next day still wasn't ready. I was exhausted, but I never allowed myself to complain in front of him. I didn't raise my son with grand promises. I taught him simple things. Work must be done honestly. Words come with responsibility. Money earned through sweat lets you sleep peacefully at night. I didn't teach him to be better than others. I taught him to be decent. Liam grew up with late dinners we shared together. Sometimes it was just a simple soup, sometimes toast and eggs. But we always sat down together and talked for a few minutes. I asked how school was. He told me small things, sometimes a bad grade, sometimes a lost game. I didn't scold him when he made mistakes, but I never ignored them. Discipline in my home wasn't harsh, but it was clear and consistent. I believe that children need boundaries, and that adults must be the ones to hold those boundaries, even when it makes them seem difficult in their child's eyes. I wasn't someone who spoke much about faith. I didn't pray for miracles. I simply believed that if you lived honestly, worked hard, and didn't deceive anyone, life might not be easy, but it wouldn't betray you. There were times when I doubted that belief, especially when I looked around and saw others taking shortcuts and still doing well. But I chose the slower path because I wanted my son to see it. Liam understood the value of work at an early age. In high school, he was asked to take a part-time job on weekends. I didn't stop him, but I required that he keep up with his studies and keep his promises. He did. We weren't perfect. We argued sometimes. There were moments when he was angry with me for being too strict with him, but there was never coldness between us. When he went to college, I kept the habit of calling him every week. Not to control him, but to ask if he was eating well and getting enough sleep. Once he forgot to call back. I waited. The next day, he apologized and said he was busy. I believed him. I always believed him. Perhaps that's why I failed to notice the most minor changes. I believe that a relationship between a mother and her child, built on sincerity, wouldn't be easily broken. I believed that what I had planted over decades would be strong enough to protect him, even when I wasn't there. Looking back, I see that I was right about many things, but there was one thing I was wrong about. I trusted too much in the natural course of things. I believed that if I didn't do wrong, wrong wouldn't find me. I forgot that sometimes evil doesn't arrive loudly. It comes softly, skillfully, often disguised as concern. When Liam became an adult and secured a stable job, I thought the most challenging part of motherhood was over. I believed I could step back and let him live his own life. I didn't know that, at that very moment, another trial was quietly taking shape, waiting for me to face it. Liam introduced Maya to me on a Sunday afternoon. He called 2 days earlier, his voice carrying a trace of nervousness that I recognized immediately. He said he wanted to bring his girlfriend over for dinner and asked if I was free. I said yes. Of course I was. I had been waiting for that moment for a long time, even if I had never said it out loud. Maya arrived right on time. She dressed simply, wore light makeup, and brought a small box of pastries. When she stepped into the house, she smiled and reached out to greet me before greeting Liam. That gesture put me at ease. During dinner, Maya spoke just enough, asked about the garden behind the house, and complimented the soup I had made. I remember thinking that my son seemed happy, and that thought made me feel lighter. In the weeks that followed, Maya appeared more often. Sometimes she came by with Liam in the evening, sometimes for weekend lunches. She was always polite, always carried a measured smile. To anyone looking in from the outside, it would have seemed that I was lucky to have a considerate future daughter-in-law. But the things that cause concern rarely arrive in rough forms. They come quietly, subtly, and are often easy to overlook, especially if you don't want to believe. I began to notice tiny details. When I asked Liam about work, Maya would often answer for him, not in a way that cut him off, but by continuing his sentence, as if she knew better. Once, I mentioned a memory from Liam's childhood, and Maya smiled lightly and said that Liam had told her a different version. She said it cheerfully, but the remark made me pause. I told myself it was just a matter of communication styles. Some people talk more, while others talk less. I didn't want to become the kind of mother who constantly finds fault with her son's girlfriend. I believed I needed to give my son space to trust his choice. Another time, during a meal, I joked that Liam used to be very frugal. Maya laughed and said that he had learned to enjoy life more now. She spoke as if saving money were a flaw that needed correcting. Liam laughed along, a little awkwardly. I stayed silent. That silence repeated itself many times. When Maya mentioned plans I had never heard Liam talk about, when she spoke about his future with certainty, as if everything had already been decided, when she used phrases like, "We've already talked about it," without looking at me, I began to feel myself slowly being pushed out of conversations that had once flowed naturally between my son and me. No one said it outright, but I felt that I no longer mattered. But the feeling was unmistakable. Some evenings, after they left, I sat alone in the kitchen and wondered if I was being too sensitive. I had lived long enough to know that not every feeling is accurate. I reminded myself, to be fair, that each generation lives differently, that my son was no longer a child who needed his mother to guide every step. My belief in goodness made me choose to slow down. I thought that if I maintained kindness and didn't react hastily, things would eventually find their balance. I believed sincerity would be recognized sooner or later. That was my first mistake. Not because Maya's actions were overt, but because I was too afraid of hurting my son. I feared that one wrong word would earn me the label of a difficult mother-in-law. I was afraid of becoming the nagging older woman people joke about in stories. And so I chose silence. I yielded. I stepped back, once, then again. I believed that if I was good enough, kind enough, no one could push me out of my son's life. I didn't know that some people don't see kindness as a boundary, but as an opportunity. And by the time I realized that, Everything had already begun to slip from my grasp, slowly but surely. The change didn't happen overnight. It came in a way that made it difficult to react because each step was so small that speaking up would make you feel like you were overreacting. At first, Liam simply called less often. Weekly calls became once every 2 weeks, then only occasionally. When I called him, he still answered, still sounded polite, but his voice no longer carried the ease it once did. He often said he was busy, a heavy workload, new projects. I believed him. I always did. I had lived long enough to know that adult life pulls people along very quickly. I reminded myself not to hold my son back with my own expectations. Then came bigger decisions, ones I learned about far too late. Liam moved to a different apartment. I only found out after he'd already moved. When I asked, he said it was a joint decision between the two of them, as it was more convenient for work. I nodded, though something inside me sank. In the past, he would have shared such things with me, not to ask permission, but to include me. Family gatherings also began to change. Weekend dinners became less frequent. When I suggested a specific day, Liam would often say he needed to check his schedule. Once I waited until evening and then received a message saying they had other plans. There was no apology, just a notification. I read the message, set my phone down, and felt my house grow quieter than usual. Maya never directly said anything I could object to. She allowed Liam to call me. She didn't ask him to avoid me. Everything unfolded reasonably, politely, and yet, little by little, I was no longer at the center of my son's life. I became someone on the margins, even though no one ever said it out loud. There were events I learned about only through social media, a short trip, a gathering with friends. I saw Liam smiling in those photos, his hand resting lightly on Maya's shoulder. I didn't feel jealous. I only wondered at what point I had been left behind. I tried not to overanalyze. I believed that if I hadn't done anything wrong, if I hadn't spoken harshly, the truth would eventually reveal itself. I believed that what isn't honest can't survive long in the light. That belief had followed me for years, helping me through the most challenging times of my life. But at the same time, another part of me began to doubt. I wondered whether my patience was being mistaken for weakness, whether my silence was creating space for others to fill with stories I knew nothing about. Once, during a rare phone call, I asked Liam if he was okay. He was quiet for a moment, then said everything was fine, but his voice didn't sound like it did when he was telling the truth. I was about to ask more, then stopped. I didn't want to become a burden. I didn't want him to feel like he had to choose between the woman he loved and me. That fear kept me stepping back. I told myself that being a mother didn't mean controlling, that my son needed to make his own decisions, that if something was wrong, he would come to me like he always had. What I didn't know was that while I was waiting, someone else was slowly rewriting my story in my son's mind, not with direct accusations, but with small, repeated suggestions, that I didn't understand, that I was outdated, that I was holding him back. Those things didn't reach me as words, but as distance. Distance in his voice, distance in his eyes, distance in decisions I was no longer asked about. I still believed in goodness. I still believed that truth doesn't need to shout. But for the first time, I began to wonder whether belief alone was enough, or whether there are moments when, if you don't stand up to protect your place, someone else will decide for you that you no longer matter. The message arrived on a weekday evening, just after I had finished washing the dishes and was sitting by the window waiting for the kettle to boil. I didn't rush to check my phone. My habit was to let things slow down after a long day. But when the screen lit up with Liam's name, I picked it up immediately. "Mom, please don't come to the ceremony this weekend. I think it would be better for everyone." I read the sentence very slowly, not because I didn't understand it, but because I was trying not to misunderstand it. I waited for another line, an explanation, a gentler sentence. But nothing followed. The message stood there, bare, like a door that had just been closed without warning. The ceremony. He didn't specify which one, but I knew. I knew because he had mentioned it before, vaguely, a significant event attended by many people, a milestone I had once believed I would stand near, quietly watching him from a distance, as I had done for so many years. I set the phone down on the table. The kettle had been boiling for some time, let out a short sound, then fell silent. I turned off the stove, poured the water into a cup, but didn't drink. My hands didn't shake. I didn't cry. I only felt an immense emptiness opens, in my chest. I replied a few minutes later, "I need to know the reason." Nearly an hour passed before Liam replied. The reason was vague. Things were tense, that there were misunderstandings, that he didn't want matters to become more complicated. There wasn't a single concrete detail, nothing I could hold on to understand or respond. I called him. No answer. I called again. The phone rang until it stopped. I didn't call again. I didn't want to turn myself into someone who clung, especially in a moment when he was clearly avoiding me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the lights off, the only illumination coming from the glow of the streetlights filtering in. I looked at the photographs on the shelf. Liam as a child smiled with missing teeth. Liam at graduation, eyes red with emotion. I wondered what I had done wrong in those memories that now made him feel the need to push me aside. I didn't blame him. I understood he was in a stage of life where every choice felt difficult. I understood he wanted to avoid conflict, but understanding didn't lessen the pain. It only made it quieter. At one point, I considered sending another message, something soft. I respected his decision, that I didn't need an explanation, that I wouldn't come. I believed that if I continued to endure, everything would eventually be okay. But then I stopped. I thought about the years that had passed, the nights I stayed up late so he could have an easier tomorrow, the times I put his well-being ahead of my own feelings. I thought about the belief I had always held, that goodness doesn't need to be loud, but it also shouldn't turn into self-erasure. I realized that silence was no longer the right choice. Not because I wanted to argue, but because if I remained silent, my story would be told by someone else, told in a way that wasn't true. As dawn approached, I stood up and opened the window. The cold air sharpened my mind. I knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. And even though I didn't yet know what I would do next, I knew one thing for sure. I could no longer stand outside my son's life. The next morning, before the sky had fully brightened, I brewed a pot of tea and sat down at the kitchen table. I no longer felt the shock from the night before. Instead, there was a strange clarity. Not the sharp alertness of anger, but the calm of someone who has accepted that standing still is no longer an option. I didn't think about revenge. I had no intention of making a scene, calling relatives, or sharing my story with friends. Those things would only tangle everything further. I believed that if I did what was right, even if it was slow, it would still leave a lasting mark. And if someone was living dishonestly, they would eventually create consequences for themselves. The first thing I did was protect what belonged to me, not out of selfishness, but because I understood that when things become unclear, clear boundaries are necessary. I reviewed old documents, accounts I had opened when Liam was still young, papers I had signed as a guarantor during the early years of his career. I worked quietly, the way I had always handled essential matters in my life. There were things I looked at that weighed heavily on my heart, not because of the money, but because I realized how easily I had given my trust. I didn't regret helping my son. I simply began to understand that help, without awareness, can become a vulnerability others exploit. I decided to seek the truth, but in a lawful and discreet manner. I didn't follow anyone. I didn't question my son's friends. I called an old acquaintance who had worked in finance and asked very general questions. I mentioned no names. I only asked about common signs of financial control in relationships. That person said the signs are rarely evident at first. They usually begin when one person gradually loses decision-making power, even though the money is still technically theirs. I listened and took note. I didn't rush to conclusions. I had learned that speculation never replaces evidence. The biggest obstacle wasn't a lack of information, but how others perceived me. When I asked a few questions, some people gently suggested that I should let my son manage his own life, that I was interfering, that I needed to let go. I didn't react. I knew they meant well, but they weren't in this house the night I received that message. They didn't hear the unfamiliar distance in my son's voice. There were days when I doubted myself. I wondered whether I was exaggerating things, whether I was letting fear lead me. I returned to my familiar belief. I didn't ask for anything. I simply reminded myself that if the truth existed, it wouldn't disappear just because I chose not to look at it. My second mistake began there. I believed that as long as the truth existed, it would speak for itself. I believed that if I didn't do wrong, wrong could not prevail. That belief had allowed me to live decently for decades, but in this situation, it made me a step too slow. I sent Liam a concise message. I told him I was willing to listen whenever he wanted to talk. I didn't mention the ceremony. I didn't mention Maya. I thought that if he saw I was calm, he would come to me on his own. There was no response. The days that followed passed in a long silence. I continued my routine: grocery shopping, watering plants, talking to neighbors. But inside me, a new boundary was forming. I began to understand that sometimes silence isn't patience, it's abandonment of oneself. I didn't want to be someone who started a war, but I also didn't want to stand outside, watching my son drift through a story I didn't fully know. If I believed in cause and effect, then my actions today were also seeds for the future, and I needed to plant them carefully. So I decided that my next steps would not be driven by emotion or assumptions. I would need truth, clear, verifiable truth. Not to defeat anyone, but so that when I spoke, I wouldn't have to apologize for speaking what was right. I didn't know then that this decision would pull me into a chain of events far larger than I imagined. I only knew that I had crossed the line of endurance, and from that point on, nothing would be simple anymore. I began with the most minor things, the ones most people overlook, not because I wanted to doubt my son, but because I had learned that truth rarely appears where people are already looking. It often hides in the most ordinary corners. One morning, I received a call from the bank. The voice on the other end was polite but cautious. They said there had been several unusual access attempts involving an old account under both my name and Liam's. I froze. That account hadn't been actively used in a long time. I asked for details. They reported multiple failed login attempts from an unfamiliar device. I hung up and sat still for a long time. I didn't rush to conclusions, but a cold feeling ran down my spine. I called the bank back and asked them to temporarily freeze the account and send me an access report. I followed every procedure. No arguments, no raised voice, just clear, lawful requests. When the report arrived, I studied the numbers and login times. Most of the access attempts happened during the day, within Liam's work hours. That confused me. Then I saw the device location. It didn't match his workplace. I said nothing to anyone. I wrote everything down carefully. I reviewed other financial documents, not to find fault, but to gain a fuller understanding of the picture. A few recent transactions made me pause. They weren't large, but they were regular in size. Payments I didn't recognize. I didn't know whether Liam was aware of them, and that uncertainty hurt the most. I decided to consult someone who could look at things objectively, a financial investigator recommended by an old acquaintance. I didn't tell the whole story. I simply showed what I had and asked a straightforward question. Were these things concerning? They reviewed everything carefully. They didn't rush to conclusions. But when they looked up, their expression hardened. They said these signs weren't random. Someone might have been controlling financial information without complete transparency. I thanked them and left, my chest heavy. I didn't feel victorious with more evidence. I felt sad to realize that my son wasn't just being taken advantage of. He was changing in ways I hadn't noticed, not outwardly, but in how he faced the truth, how he avoided it. How did he let others speak for him? One afternoon, Maya appeared unexpectedly at my door. No warning, no call. She stood there, her familiar smile gone. She said she wanted to talk. I invited her in, not because I wanted confrontation, but because I wanted to see her up close and personal. The conversation wasn't long. Maya said I was worrying too much, that Liam was grown and had the right to decide for himself. She said what I was seeing was a result of misunderstandings. Her voice was slightly rushed, no longer as natural as before. There was a brief moment when she paused mid-sentence, her eyes flicking quickly toward the window, a flash of unease she couldn't hide. I didn't argue. I asked just one question. Why were there account accesses Liam had never mentioned? Maya froze, only for a second, but enough. Then she said it was just a convenience, that Liam had asked her to help manage a few things. She spoke very quickly, as if rehearsed. I nodded. Not because I believed her, but because I understood the purpose of this conversation. It wasn't about truth. It was about controlling the narrative. When Maya left, I felt more tired than angry. I saw clearly that I was facing someone terrified of losing what she had worked so hard to build. That evening, I received a message from Liam. He said Maya had told him about the visit. He said I was making things uncomfortable, that I should trust him. I read the message many times. In every sentence, I felt not anger, but defensiveness, and that hurt more than blame. I replied briefly. I told him I loved him and only wanted him to be safe. I didn't send evidence. I didn't list what I knew. I realized that if I revealed everything now, he wouldn't hear it. Truth, thrown at the wrong moment, only builds thicker defenses. In the days that followed, things accelerated. The access attempts continued, the transactions continued. I documented everything, not to accuse anyone, but to prepare for the moment when the truth could no longer be denied. There were nights I couldn't sleep, not from fear, but from sadness. Sadness at watching my son slowly become someone I didn't recognize. Not a bad person, but someone letting others live his life for him. I wondered how blinding love could be. I still believed in cause and effect. I believed no one could build a future on deception without paying a price. But this time, I didn't just wait. I prepared, not to punish, but so that when the truth surfaced, my son wouldn't have to face it alone. The meeting took place on a lightly rainy afternoon. Liam texted that he wanted to talk, his tone brief and unlike himself. I agreed immediately, not because I expected an easy reconciliation, but because I knew some things could only be said when all three of us sat together. They arrived together. Maya entered first, familiar enough to act as if this house were hers. Liam followed, avoiding my eyes. I invited them to sit. I poured tea. I didn't ask how they were. I let the silence speak. Maya was the one who began. She said things had gone too far, that I was stressing Liam, that my actions were harming their relationship. She spoke smoothly, each sentence sounding reasonable. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she stopped, I turned to Liam. I asked two simple questions. Did he know about the account access? Did he know about the transactions he hadn't personally made? Liam hesitated. He said Maya helped manage small things. He said he trusted her. Maya immediately continued. She said it was convenient. In a serious relationship, sharing is a regular part of the relationship. Her voice sharpened slightly, as if afraid I might say something. I nodded. I said sharing was regular, but control was not. I spoke slowly. I didn't present documents. I didn't read the numbers. I simply said some things had crossed the line of transparency. Maya smiled, a thin, quick smile. She said I was imagining things, that I didn't understand their world, that I was trying to maintain power by planting doubt. She said that if I continued, Liam would have to make a choice. The ultimatum was delivered softly, but clearly. Either I stopped, or I would be removed from my son's life. No middle ground, no compromise. I looked at Liam. He said nothing. His silence hurt more than any accusation. But I also saw something else in his eyes. Exhaustion, confusion, fear of standing between two women he loved in very different ways. I took a deep breath. I said I didn't want to defeat anyone. I only wanted the truth respected. I said I couldn't pretend to see what was happening, and I wouldn't apologize for that. Maya stood up. She said I was destroying their happiness, that I was selfish. I couldn't accept my son's adulthood. Her voice rose. The familiar control disappeared. In that moment, the mask fell. I saw someone terrified of losing the position she had worked so hard to secure. I didn't respond in kind. I said that if I was wrong, the truth would prove it. And if I was right, silence would only make things worse. I said I wasn't turning my back on my son, but I also wouldn't turn my back on the values that had shaped me all my life. Liam finally spoke. He said he needed time. Maya turned to him, her voice sharp. There was no time. Either he stood with her, or it ended now. I saw Liam's hand tremble. He looked at me, then at Maya. The struggle was written across his face. I didn't intervene. I didn't plead. I believe some choices only matter when people make them themselves. Finally, Maya pulled Liam to his feet. She said they were leaving, that I would no longer be invited to any events, that I should prepare myself for losing my son. They left in heavy silence. The door closed. I stood still for a long time. I didn't feel strong. I felt honest. I knew the price of honesty could be high, but I also knew that bowing to what was wrong would erase the person I had spent decades trying to be. That evening, I sat alone in the living room. I didn't ask for anything. I simply reminded myself that I had done everything I could without harming anyone with cruel words. I believed that when people choose manipulation, they eventually have to face the consequences of that choice. And I knew that from this moment on, everything would move in a different direction. Not easy, not gentle, but real. After that confrontation, I didn't hear anything from Liam for many days. No calls, no messages. This silence was different from before. It was no longer avoidance, but a heavy pause, as if he was carrying something he hadn't yet found words for. I didn't reach out first. Not because I was cold, but because I understood that while he was still caught in the spiral, anything I said would be filtered through suspicion. Some truths can only be accepted when a person experiences them firsthand. Liam began to notice small things first. Money in his account was disappearing faster than he had planned. Bills he didn't remember paying. Decisions made in his name, without his involvement. At first, he blamed himself for being careless. He thought it was the cost of being busy, of trusting too much. But then there were details that no longer made sense. One time, Liam asked Maya about a specific expense. She answered quickly, but didn't look him in the eye. She said they had already discussed it. He didn't remember. He asked again. Her response turned irritated, that he was doubting without reason, that he was being influenced by me. That sentence made him stop short. Not out of anger, but because for the first time, he realized my name was appearing in conversations I wasn't part of, and not in a neutral way. Liam began to recheck things he had previously ignored. He looked at transaction histories. He reread old messages. He paid attention to how Maya reacted when he asked questions that didn't follow the familiar script. There was no explosive moment, just an accumulation of minor signs, enough to create a sense of unease he couldn't shake. One evening, when Maya went out, Liam sat alone in the new apartment. He opened his laptop and logged into an account he had rarely reviewed carefully before. He saw logins from devices that weren't his. He saw transfers he had never made. The amounts weren't large, but they were repeated. He didn't call me. He didn't call Maya. He just sat there for a long time. Perhaps in that moment he remembered the way I had spoken. Not accusations, but my tone. Calm. Unforcing. Not demanding that he choose right away. The decision came to Liam not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. Exhaustion from constant defensiveness. Exhaustion from the feeling that he was no longer the one steering his own life. He understood that if he continued, he would be trading away more than money. He would be giving up his self-respect. When Liam spoke to Maya again, he didn't raise his voice. He simply asked clearly, questions that couldn't be avoided. Maya responded with tears, then anger. She said he had changed, that he was no longer on her side, that he was betraying her. An ultimatum was issued, this time not to me, but to him. Either he continued to trust unconditionally, or everything ended. Liam chose the more challenging path. He packed his things in silence. There were no dramatic arguments, no long goodbye, just a painful but clear decision. As he walked out of that apartment, he knew he was losing a future he had once imagined, but at the same time, he knew he was reclaiming something far more critical. He drove to my house early the next morning. I opened the door and saw him standing there, eyes red, shoulders heavy like a tired child. He didn't speak right away. He simply bowed his head very low. He said he was sorry not for one specific action, but for not listening sooner. I didn't say that I had been right. I just held him. There are moments when explanations are no longer necessary. He awakened not because he was forced, but because he saw the truth for himself. And though that path was painful, I knew it was the right one. The days that followed passed slowly, as if life itself needed time to rearrange. I didn't push Liam to do anything. I didn't ask him too many questions. He stayed at my house, slept in his old room, woke up earlier than usual, and sat quietly for hours at the kitchen table. Some wounds don't need comfort. They need space to heal. The truth was gradually confirmed, not through a dramatic moment, but through small, precise steps. Liam contacted the bank. The irregular transactions were reviewed. Some amounts were confirmed to have been made without his consent. Logins from unfamiliar devices were documented. It was no longer a feeling or a suspicion. Everything appeared in paperwork and numbers. Liam met with a lawyer on the advice of a friend. I didn't go with him. I stayed home, brewed tea, and looked out at the garden. I believed that everyone had to walk their own path. When he returned, his face was tired but calmer. He said nothing would be easy, that it would take time, but he no longer felt led by someone else. That alone was a significant change. Maya didn't disappear immediately. She called, she texted, sometimes apologizing, sometimes blaming, sometimes blaming circumstances. I didn't read those messages. I didn't answer those calls. Not because I despised her, but because I didn't want to cultivate any more negativity inside myself. I believed that everyone must be responsible for their actions without needing me to stand in judgment over them. Consequences came to each person differently. Liam had to face the truth that he had placed his trust in the wrong place. That hurt him more than any financial loss. He had to relearn how to listen to himself, how to ask questions, how not to hand his life over for someone else to decide. It was the cost of late, but necessary maturity. As for Maya, I heard that she has faced legal and social consequences. Not immediately, not loudly, but enough to disrupt the path she had chosen. I didn't feel pleased hearing that. I didn't feel vindicated. I only felt a familiar order of life quietly correcting itself. As for me, I didn't feel like I had won. I only felt lighter. Lighter because I hadn't turned away from what I believed was right. Lighter because I hadn't allowed fear to silence me until I lost myself. Lighter because my son, though wounded, still retained the ability to stand up and move forward. I sat alone in the living room on a quiet afternoon. Sunlight fell gently across the floor. I thought about cause and effect, not as punishment, but as a natural flow. What is sown will be met in its own way in time. I didn't wish for anyone to pay a heavy price. I only hoped that from what had happened, each person would learn what they needed to learn. And for me, that was enough. Healing did not arrive the moment everything became clear. It did not appear as an instant sense of relief. Instead, it came slowly, piece by piece, through the small details of everyday life. Liam stayed at my house for a while longer. No one said it out loud, but we both understood that, for now, he needed a place that did not require him to be strong. In the mornings, we drank coffee together. We didn't always talk. Some days, it was simply the quiet presence of two people sharing the same space. I didn't ask him about Maya. I didn't ask about what had already passed. I believed that if he wanted to speak, he would. And if he wasn't ready yet, then silence, too, was part of the healing process. Gradually, Liam began to open up. Not about the big mistakes, but about small moments. Times when he felt uneasy but pushed the feeling aside. Moments when he convinced himself that everything was fine, even when it wasn't. I listened without interrupting, without correcting. I understood that he didn't need guidance at the moment. He needed acceptance. Forgiveness, to me, has never meant forgetting what happened. I recall vividly the days when I was overlooked. I remember the feeling of being misunderstood. But I don't hold resentment. I don't bring it up to make him feel ashamed. I forgive because I don't want to carry that weight into the days ahead. I also forgave myself. Forgave myself for staying silent for too long. Forgave myself for believing that kindness alone was enough. I came to understand that being a good person does not mean having no boundaries. And setting boundaries does not make you colder. It simply allows you to live more truthfully. After everything, my family became smaller in number but clearer in meaning. There were no longer relationships built on pretense or fear, only people who could sit together, speak honestly, listen sincerely, and accept one another's imperfections. Some evenings, Liam helped me in the garden. We didn't talk about the distant future. We only discussed things close at hand for tomorrow. I looked at my son, no longer the boy he once was, but no longer the stranger I had once felt he had become. He was finding his way back, little by little, not back to me, but back to himself. I often thought about forgiveness, not as a noble act, but as a necessary choice. Forgiveness does not make others more right. It simply keeps you from being trapped in what is already past, and sometimes that absence of bitterness creates the space for others to change. I realized that family is not a place without wounds. Family is a place where people are allowed to heal after being wounded, not by denying what happened, but by facing it together. When I saw Liam smile again, not a forced smile, but a light, unburdened one, I knew we had traveled a very long road, not easy, not perfect, but real. And in that truth, I found again the sense of peace I had nearly lost. One late afternoon, I stood in the small garden behind the house, trimming branches that had grown in the wrong direction for a long time. Nearby, Liam was adjusting the old wooden fence. We didn't say much. We simply did our work, wrapped in a calm I once thought would never return. I looked at my son, slower now, more reflective, but also steadier. I no longer saw the impulsive confidence he once had, but a new kind of calm, earned through experience. I didn't ask him what he had learned. I believed that the most important lessons don't need to be spoken out loud. I thought about family, not as an idealized concept, but as a relationship that requires care. Family doesn't last simply because of shared blood. It needs respect, listening, and clear boundaries. Older people don't need to be placed above others, but they do deserve to be treated with kindness and trust. I also thought about love. For a long time, I believed that love meant yielding until you disappeared. Now I understand that love sometimes means standing firm, refusing to step back from what is wrong, even when that leaves you alone for a while. I don't regret what I did. I don't wish things had unfolded differently. Every stage brings its own lesson, and I believe those lessons arrive at the right time, even if not in comfortable ways. As the sun began to set, Liam looked up at me and asked if I wanted to go inside. I nodded. We walked in together, closing the door behind us, not to shut out the world, but to protect the peace we had worked so hard to reclaim. If there is one thing I want to leave behind after this story, it is not advice, but a reminder. Believe in what is right. Protect your family with kindness and resolve. And don't be afraid to stand firm, even when the path means walking alone for a while.